Good evening and welcome to this first meeting of the Graduate Studies Seminar for the spring semester. Tonight we are pleased to introduce Professor Karl Appuhn, current visiting professor at La Pietra for the entire semester. Professor Appuhn is Associate Professor of History and Italian Studies in the Department of History at NYU in New York. His research interests cover a wide space in the field of history and Italian studies, from environmental history to history of science, from history of animals to the Italian Renaissance. In particular, he states to be interested in the ways that technical and scientific expertise helped individuals and institutions make sense of the connections between society and nature. Among his many publications, we can remember A Forest on the Sea, Environmental Expertise in Renaissance Venice, 2009, that won several awards, such as the Herbert Baxter Adam Prize. His essays, Friend or Flood, The Dilemmas of Flood Control in the Late Renaissance Venice, in The Nature of Cities, New Approaches to Urban Environmental History in 2006, and Ecologies of Beef, 18th Century Epizootics in the Environmental History of Early Modern Europe, appeared in the journal Environmental History in 2010. He's currently working on a history of veterinary medicine in 17th and 18th century Italy. For this reason, tonight he will be speaking about Venice and the Veterinarian, Enlightenment, Epidemics, and the creation of the chair of veterinary medicine at Padua. Please join me in welcoming Professor Karl Appuhn.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Nice to see everyone. So I'd like to start today on the 26th of August in 1724, when the Venetian public health authorities, these were the people called the Provveditori alla Sanità, issued an emergency proclamation. Having received word of an outbreak of an unspecified disease among sheep in the Duchy of Milan, the elected heads of Venice's Sanità were eager to impose immediate prophylactic measures throughout the Republic's mainland territories. In particular, they wished to avoid direct contact between Venetian sheep and Milanese sheep, and to that end they suspended commerce, or at least ovine commerce, with the duchy. Live animals could not be bought or sold across the border until further notice, and neither could mutton, wool, or any other primary or secondary product of the sheep trade. That is to say that in the summer of 1724, Venice imposed a good old-fashioned quarantine, the public health measure par excellence of the early modern period. The only unusual feature is that it targeted a specific domesticated animal rather than people. From the very first outbreak of plague, I was in a hurry to get to that second page, the Black Death in 1348, public authorities had viewed halting the movement of people and material objects as the first and best recourse available. The Pistoia Plague Ordinances, perhaps the best-known legal document from 1348, specify a number of material objects, including bolts of cloth that were forbidden to cross the city gates for the duration of the emergency. Naturally, not everyone appreciated quarantine restrictions, and regulations were most often observed in the breach. The archives of nearly every European state are rife with quarantines broken by everyone from smugglers seeking illicit profits to people intent on making votive offerings at a nearby shrine or witnessing the procession of a powerful relic in a neighboring town. This is the Carlo Cipolla's Faith, Reason, and the Plague is the kind of classic study of this. For European states, then, the fight against epidemic disease was not just a struggle against the many possible causes of mass illness, but a struggle to control individual and group behavior. Now, in many ways, the late 17th and 18th century responses to cattle plagues fit quite well into this narrative. And now there's a contractual obligation you have when you're working on 18th century cattle plagues, which is to show this image. So I've performed my fiduciary duty here. This is an 18th century Dutch engraving of, well, you can see a bovine plague or a rinderpest, and you can see the poor cows, feet in the air, and the peasants lamenting their fate, and some very well-intentioned member of the local gentry waving to them and telling them that it's all going to be okay. And of course, it wasn't. This is a really famous episode in European history, these 18th century cattle plagues, but it's only been studied essentially as a kind of economic story more than anything else, and it hasn't been studied as a kind of key moment in the history of medicine. So back to our story in 1724, the late 17th and 18th century responses to these plagues fit really well into this narrative. The sanità that blocked sheep commerce with Milan in 1724 was the same institution that intervened in the famous epidemics of 1575 and 1630 that resulted in the construction of these monumental churches in Venice, and of course, most famously in Venice, the syphilis epidemics that ravaged the city throughout the early modern period. Indeed, the quarantine measures, burial practices, and other strategies employed to combat epizootics were by and large the very same rules that public health officials had long used to limit the spread of epidemics of all kinds. In other words, in 1724, the quarantine system was an automatic reflex. It was just something that they did. It was a well-tested political and medical mechanism. It required no debate. And I just want to say something about two terms I'm going to use. For this audience, you probably don't care, but veterinarians care deeply about this, and again, this is a kind of fiduciary duty. So I use the term epizootic. I will also use the term zoonotic at a certain point. These are both different kinds of animal diseases. The difference is that a zoonotic can jump to humans, right? And of course, the most famous recent zoonotic is the 2008-2009 swine flu outbreak that was called the Mexican swine flu. This was actually, it's a little bit like the story of the Milanese sheep, because American politicians were very quick to label it the Mexican swine flu, and then this is an editorial cartoon of which there were many that appeared in a Mexican newspaper criticizing this choice. What are you bringing from Mexico? and the bacillus looking very innocent there along the side. So the 1724, which is all to say that this is not a story that's gone away. It's a story that gets repeated over and over and over again. The 1724 sheep quarantine, therefore, is part of a longer history of public health measures that brings us all the way to today. Nonetheless, if the emergence of epizootic events, animal-only diseases, as a major medical problem in the late 17th century appeared to confirm the power of early modern institutions and procedures, these quarantine procedures, it also challenged the ideas about disease that underpinned those institutions in increasingly important ways. Quarantine might well have been the best available response for both epizootic and epidemic events, but animal plagues turned out to be quite different from human ones in important ways. And those differences ultimately forced medical thinkers and state officials alike to reassess many deeply held beliefs about medicine, contagion, and public health. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. It's one of the central contentions of the project from which this talk is drawn, which is a book project that because epizootic diseases proved far more challenging and threatening than the more familiar epidemic ones, they became a central issue, not just in the realm of institutional practice, quarantine or not quarantine, but in 18th century medical thought more broadly. For contemporaries and historians alike, the most obvious result of this was the invention of veterinary medicine as a separate professional discipline and hadn't existed before the 18th century. It's really 1762 is the first year we can speak about something that we would call veterinary medicine existing as a scientific discipline. But debates over the etiology, the origins, the consequences of epizootics also serve to draw medical writers and public health officials specifically, into realms of thought and practice that had previously lain completely outside their purview. As beef cattle, which were the primary vector for most 18th century livestock diseases, the Dutch engraving, Docket, in this case, became an increasingly important part of the rural economy. Physicians interested in epizootics became enthusiastic contributors to debates within another relatively new field of science, agrarian science. And because no public health system, however well organized, could ever hope to contain epizootics within the increasingly important system of national borders, animal diseases emerged as an important feature of legal and political relations between states. And I'm not going to have time to talk about that today, but let's just say that every single one of these outbreaks requires an actual diplomatic negotiation to resolve, because you have to agree that there are no more sick cows on the other side of the border, and you have to take it as a kind of act of diplomatic faith. The reflections of physicians, public health officials, agronomists, and other writers were rarely coherent, and we wouldn't expect them to be. They reflect competing priorities. For example, the economic imperative to increase stocking densities of cattle, how many cattle you could keep per hectare, conflicted with the desire to minimize the economic effects of repeated epizootic outbreaks, because the more cows you have per hectare, the worse the outbreaks are. Nevertheless, the central importance of both epizootic and zoonotic diseases, the ones that can jump, in 18th century rural economies and 18th century medical thought and practice makes them worthy of exploration. So it might seem so obvious that it doesn't bear any particular mention, but the fact that so many of the biggest public health crises of the 18th century involved animals raised a number of serious practical and epistemological problems. On the practical side, animals don't behave like people. People who disobeyed health authorities or flaunted quarantine, they could be caught, they could be punished. Their ships and goods could be confiscated, they could be burned, they could be imprisoned. Animals were different. They had minds of their own, but no capacity to understand or obey laws, and no respect for the kind of political and juridical boundaries that were the central element of public health efforts in this period. How do you tell a sheep to obey quarantine? Animals could and did choose to flee their human masters. They could travel great distances. They could cross boundaries of every sort, while unknowingly carrying death and social disruption with them. Officials at all levels of the state understood this, and their reflections on the topic provide actually kind of interesting and sometimes fun reading. To return to the opening example, in that summer of 1724, the Provvitoria Sanità took it as a given that the sheep in question were potentially dangerous actors. They admonished local authorities that, quote, "In its initial stages, such a disease imbues sheep with a great fury, and they often disperse and become vagrants," unquote. And the term that they use for vagrant is actually a juridical term. Furious sheep, in other words, acted independently and in ways best understood by themselves, which made controlling their movements a challenge. This emphasis on what I could provisionally call the animal's agency turns out to be a common assertion in a wide variety of 18th century sources. Medical and agrarian writers also took the idea surprisingly seriously that animals acted on their own. The notion that animals act of their own accord seems to have been well accepted in a pretty wide variety, surprisingly wide variety of contexts. So, for example, in 1779, a butcher from a town near Padua bought 2 steers in Venice. This is an auction, I'll explain it in just a second, that turned out to be carriers of rinderpest or cattle plague. Unfortunately for him, and as it turned out for a lot of other people, this fact only came to light after they escaped his control following a random encounter with a dog. He's taking them back to slaughter them, and this dog comes out, barks, and the 2 cows bolt, the 2 steers bolt. When the time came to assign blame for a costly epizootic event, the butcher was never in jeopardy because it was understood that startled cattle can escape, after which they tend to seek out other cows for company. And so he was absolved of responsibility, but something on the order of about 850 cattle died in the subsequent event. Remaining in the realm of legal definitions, again, the choice of that term vagrant in the 1724 dispatch seems significant. It was certainly a common pejorative term in the period, but it was also a juridical one with a fairly precise meaning. Landless and usually unmarried men who wandered outside their home jurisdiction without authorization or true purpose. To call the sheep vagrants, therefore, implied that caught up in their diseased furor, the animals became lawless, wandering without a fixed destination, causing trouble. And like their human counterparts, furious, vagrant sheep needed to be visibly branded so that potential victims could see the approaching danger and act accordingly. This was a common punishment in Venice, was that you would brand banditi so that people would know who they were dealing with. The Sanità decreed that, quote, "so that they may not go wandering and thereby contaminate healthy herds, all infected animals, or even suspected of infection, should be marked on their flank with a red semicircle." So they had to paint a red circle on them. They had to brand them, also in a way which incidentally damaged their economic value, because painted wool is pointless to shear. But the animals' lack of self-discipline was far from the only practical challenge that these new diseases posed. Human epidemics were largely urban affairs. Disease flourished where populations were densest and living conditions the worst. This is not to say that rural areas did not experience spikes in mortality, and there's a lot of recent work about this, about the plague in the countryside. They did, but the institutional political focus was always on city, especially port cities and market towns, because these were the key nodes through which diseases traveled. Epizootic diseases, of course, flipped this familiar script on its head. The outbreak still occurred where populations were densest and living conditions poor, but for large domesticated animals, this meant the countryside, pastures and large barns. If the animals themselves were hard to control, so were the areas in which they lived. Without choke points such as docks or city gates, officials were overwhelmed by the challenges of maintaining quarantine across a wide rural space. Again, we needn't guess about this. This isn't just my supposition, just ad fontem. During a major outbreak in 1705, the Venetian governor at Palmanova near the Habsburg border wrote to Venice to inform his superiors that he had, quote, sent patrols into the countryside to shoot alien animals, unquote, without specifying how his troops were expected to distinguish between alien animals and, cittadini, I guess. Presumably not all sick or foreign animals were conveniently marked. Similarly, in 1738, during another bovine outbreak, the governor at Brescia, on the other side of Venetian territory, wrote to Venice to say that his men were patrolling the Adda River at night so that they could shoot any cattle approaching the river to drink, and especially at anyone trying to dump a dead animal in the river. In other words, controlling rural space and animal behaviors was far more difficult than isolating people inside a town like Montelupo, right? You can't just lock the gate. So from the outset, epizootic diseases generated a new kind of practical challenge that existing public health institutions were really ill-equipped to handle. And each of these practical problems generated a corresponding epistemological problem. The issue of animal minds or animal agency, or perhaps we should now call it the problem of ovine fury, raises a number of crucial questions about the boundaries between humans and other animals. It challenged Cartesian definitions of the body, which were quite dominant in 18th century culture, and there would be reasons to assume, as we'll see in a second, that they would dominate this new field of veterinary medicine as well. These Cartesian definitions of animals as simple mechanical apparatuses. Giuseppe Orus, and this is the first time, but it's not the last time you'll hear about him, who was the first chair of veterinary medicine at the University of Padua, repeatedly referred to livestock as, quote, machines that suffer, unquote, macchine che soffrono. And in one memorable instance says macchine che pensano, or che ragionano. The issue, so this is kind of an interesting problem. So how does a machine think? How does a machine suffer? The issue of imposing control on rural space, for want of a better term, which is the second issue here, led many medical writers to reassess some deeply held views about contagion and etiology. And it also led them to enter aggressively into emerging debates about rural improvement, to the point that practitioners of the new science of veterinary medicine would eventually be found offering advice on everything from barn construction to pasture regulation, issues that would surely have baffled physicians in the 16th and 17th centuries. And finally, while I won't have time to discuss this today, perhaps the most unexpected consequence was that physicians began to pronounce strong opinions on how national borders, this goes back to this other issue, should be monitored and controlled. That's to say that the new veterinary medicine had something to say about issues of state sovereignty as well. And this was new territory, forgive me, for medicine, indeed. So let's just very quickly orient you. Why Venice? Venice was the northernmost hub of a peninsular cattle trade, that is to say, a cattle trade that went all the way down the Italian peninsula as early as the 16th century. And what this map shows you is the principal routes through which beef cattle came to Venice. From an early date, Venetian merchants imported most of their cattle from the Hungarian plain, and so that's that route there, kind of central route. And then there's a smaller route that actually comes by sea. They had a special kind of boat called a manzera, which makes sense if you think about it. It was a specially designed barge that would take cattle from Zara or Zadar and ship them to Venice. And they actually kept them penned on the Lido, and then they would auction them there. And but most of them came through the central route from Hungary. And of course, that was the site of a really long-standing ongoing conflict, military conflict between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. And this caused really regular disruptions all the way through the 16th and the 17th century, which limited the scale of this trade. And this is not to say that Italy had no cattle without this trade. Italians still relied on oxen to pull plows and perform other necessary agrarian tasks. And local landowners often kept small herds, but mainly for dairy, not for meat, especially in central and northern Italy. But for those dairy herds, replacement animals were provided by breeding, and then only old animals, or what we would now today call downers, would go to slaughter. So consequently, there's limited scale of this trade in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the isolation of the dairy herds basically meant that foreign epizootics did not pose a serious threat. There are a few isolated outbreaks in the 16th century, but they don't become really a regular feature until the 1680s, which is not a coincidence because 1683 is when this military conflict ends and the Hungarian plain stabilizes and it becomes a regular market. And these new denser connections between Venice and Hungary provided protein surpluses, and they provided ready access to secondary products of the beef trade, tallow most importantly for candles, but also hides and intestines, and the Venetians kept track of all of this, and I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A. So I actually have stats for how many sausage casings they handed out to the sausage makers and so on, but that I don't have time to get into today. But these connections also created the conditions for much less benign forms of biotic exchange. Almost as soon as Hungarian cattle started flowing into Venetian territory in the 1680s, local herds along the trade routes began to manifest signs of an unknown respiratory disease. Witnesses reported seeing, quote, beasts with white foam around their nostrils, followed by difficulty breathing and an unwillingness to take food, unquote. More alarmingly, quote, the affliction moves rapidly from one beast to the next, so that if the sick cattle are not quickly separated from the rest, all will soon die, unquote. For Venetian property owners and peasants alike, the prospect of an uncontrolled bovine plague caused fear. Because of their reliance on draft oxen, the worst case consequences were pretty much nothing short of apocalyptic. It would shut down the entire agricultural economy. It's no surprise, therefore, that Venice and other Italian states developed an immediate interest in controlling the spread of these bovine epizootics specifically. As I discussed at the beginning, the initial reaction was to extend the authority of existing public health institutions. Give it to the sanità, let them impose quarantines. But ignorance of rural environments and the treatment of live animals hampered the ability of these older plague magistracies to mount an effective response. Most plague doctors worked from a fairly uniform set of ideas, most of them Galenic, which in itself is not a problem, as we'll see in a second. And while this framework assumed basic similarities between human and animal bodies, it also made the search for a convincing causal account of these new diseases really difficult. Traditional Galenic diagnostic procedures required the physician to look to the qualities of place, air, water, local foodstuffs first, when searching for the cause of an illness. However, producing a sophisticated environmental etiology, like how does the environment make these animals sick, for cows required a familiarity with the lifeways of cows. Where do they like to go? What do they prefer to eat? And so on. And city doctors just didn't have this, and they weren't going to get it. The people who did possess that knowledge, as well as meaningful empirical experience with sick animals, were farriers and blacksmiths. But given the lack of any meaningful connection or dialogue between farriers on the one hand and physicians on the other, it proved maddeningly difficult for the sanita's doctors, or protomedici, to access the expertise of the people on the ground. In other words, the perfect correspondence between the rules for epidemics and the rules for epizootics, which looked like a thoughtful response at first, actually reflects profound ignorance on the part of public health authority. Now, these new diseases did lay beyond the experience of most physicians at the close of the 17th century. Those in the employ of public health institutions evinced surprisingly little concern over their own lack of concrete knowledge of bovine habits or physiology. Nor does it appear that they made much of an effort to consult local farriers, as I said. The dispatches of public health officials to Venice consistently referred to local farriers and blacksmiths as rude persons or unlettered people. And this might seem like a common sense accusation, but it actually turns out to be completely false, or at least partially false. Giuseppe Orus, when he becomes the professor of veterinary medicine at Padua, one of the first things he does is he commissions a survey of farriers all over Venetian territory. And what he wants is he wants to create a glossary of names for the different diseases. And he wants to know, describe these symptoms, and then what do you call it, so that when you go to visit the site of an outbreak in Istria, you know what their local term for foaming at the nostrils is. That's what he set out to discover, but what the survey actually ends up revealing is that farriers were familiar with a shocking range of veterinary literature. They weren't unlettered at all. They read, both printed and in manuscript. So some of these guys had read farriery manuals that existed that were never came off of printing press, that circulated only as manuscript copies, and therefore were extremely rare. Now, the printed farriery manuals were a long established genre. Italian printing houses had been in the business of churning out these manuals for well over a century by this time, actually almost two. By the time the cattle plagues became a source of concern in the 1680s, farriery manuals were, as I say, a well-established genre. Such texts as Scacco da Tagliacozzo's L'anatomia del cavallo in 1591, Agostino Columbre's Della natura dei cavalli, 1597, and the most famous early modern farrier text is actually an English text, Markham Gervais's Cheap and Good Husbandry of 1614. All these texts enjoyed wide circulation in multiple editions and translations. The only problem from the point of view of public health officials was that these texts were almost exclusively concerned with equine health. The texts were aimed at an aristocratic audience. They all treated the problem of selecting mounts suitable for battle, or just for impressing your friends. And they explained how to identify those physical traits that were most predictive of a noble character in a horse, among which was actually national origin of the horse. So horses from certain places were understood to be more noble than horses from others. These were not the subjects of greatest concern, or really of any concern, to a protomedico facing a barn full of ailing cows. But literate farriers hoping to profit from aristocratic patronage and employment, and Scacco da Tagliacozzo is one of these. He was actually a Genoese cardinal's stable master, would have been keenly interested in L'anatomia del cavallo. Nevertheless, texts such as Tagliacozzo's ultimately served as the first bridge between the traditional practices of farriery and the world of medicine, because if the protomedici weren't willing to take the farriers seriously, they were willing to take books seriously. By the first 2 decades of the 18th century, abridged versions of treatment regimes taken verbatim from L'anatomia del cavallo and other farriery manuals began to appear in the archives of the Sanità. The complete versions in the manuals covered more than just recipes for preparing compound medicines. They often included specific recommendations about the timing of treatment with respect to astrological conditions, a staple of Renaissance medicine. So probably, hopefully, everybody in this room has seen one of these Renaissance astrological bodies, where that is really, as I say, in a lot of Renaissance texts, there will be the picture of the human body, and then there will be astrological signs that correspond to particular body parts, and that this is key to developing a proper treatment regimen, is that you have to treat problems of the genitals or problems of the head at certain times of the month or the year. This is Scacco da Tagliacozzo's astrological horse. And for those of you who are interested in this, very quickly, there's not a perfect correspondence here between the human astrological body and the equine astrological body, but some of them are the same. So Leo is the sign of the heart in both, but for example, how Cancer turns out to be the sign of the foreleg is a bit of a mystery. You can't quite work it out in all these different cases. I'll just give you a couple of examples of how this works. Public health authorities weren't really that interested in this. They were mostly interested in just learning the formulas. They wanted the recipes, and that's what they copy down. Recipes for treating sick cattle that are preserved in the records of the Sanità include such prescriptions as scraping the tongue with a solid silver knife, and having the animal drink a mixture of red wine and herbs through a funnel. And if any of you ever handled a cow, it's really, really difficult to get them to do what you want. And I'm still trying to figure out how they get this funnel shoved down the poor animal's throat so that they can pour this mixture in. Never mind what red wine does to in a cow's digestive system. So, for example, but to the extent that such issues as astrological correspondences appear in public health documents, they're always linked to the administrations of drugs. So, for example, it was generally understood in these recipes that respiratory elements should not be treated when the moon was full or Venus was ascendant, because the moisture would counteract the good effects of the drug and you wouldn't cure your patient. So this state of affairs held steady for the first third of the 18th century. Bovine plagues flared up somewhere in Venetian territory about every 4 years on average. It's quite frequently, really, a lot more frequently than human plague ever did. Public health officials and local governors would issue quarantine proclamations. Inspecting physicians would turn up at the site of the outbreak. They would scold farriers for being unlettered while prescribing standard remedies taken verbatim from printed farriery manuals. Go figure. The mirroring of regulations designed to combat epidemic plagues produced at best inconsistent results, but panicked local officials often seemed happy for the clear rules. The impetus for changing the status quo would have to come from outside the world of public health institutions. I'm going to show you just a couple more images. There are lots of these. My personal favorite is a late 16th century equine anatomy written by a nobleman from Bologna. This is Carlo Ruini's L'Anatomia del Cavallo. Maybe some of you know it or you don't. This is, and it's great because it is modeled on Vesalius's anatomy. And it has exactly the same format. It's a giant folio book, and there's, on the left folio, there's a description of what you're seeing. On the right folio, there are these engravings that look exactly like the ones in Vesalius. And you can see that Ruini and others did dissections. So you have the exposed brain of the horse. Here you have the vascular system of the horse's head. I guess I decided to spare you. There's some really kind of graphic ones that show the pregnant mare with her viscera exposed and so on and so forth. So it's really an amazing text, and it again sort of demonstrates in a way that these printed texts were navigating in a kind of different world from the world of the people who were actually reading them, who turned out mostly to be farriers, surprisingly enough. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about agrarian reform. And back to 18th century Venice. It was kind of a peculiar place. It was 2 centuries removed from great power status, and the Venetians and their mainland subjects concerned themselves mostly with projects for internal administrative reform. They couldn't influence the course of continental affairs anymore, so they tried to influence their own. The most interesting aspect of this, at least for me, is that the bourgeois residents of mainland cities came to play an increasingly important role in these projects. They hadn't been important people in the 16th century and the 15th century when Venice was at its height, but in the 18th century they were incredibly important players in Venetian culture and politics. Beginning in the 1740s, mainland elites in subject cities began to establish academies as venues for enlightened debate and springboards for potential reforms. And these were modeled on French academies. And as we'll see, the French model is important here. The academies attracted men from the professions, lawyers, doctors, and notaries mostly, rather than traditional aristocratic elites or landowners. In smaller, per modo di dire, rural centers such as Belluno, Udine, and Verona, the academies sought to tackle problems of agrarian reform. This was their main interest. The principal goal of the agrarian reformers was to free the republic from the yoke of food imports. They wanted autarky through improved cropping and husbandry techniques, in public orations, pamphlets, essay contests, and through the periodical Giornale d'Italia. The members of the academies debated the best way for Venice to achieve caloric independence. Epizootic diseases did not assume a prominent position in debates over agrarian reform at first. Crop rotations, seed selection, and the use of mineral-based fertilizers dominate discussions in the Giornale d'Italia. When agrarian writers tackled the problem of husbandry, they mainly concerned themselves with stocking densities and pasture management, and this was mostly about how to get enough fodder to keep a large herd, and this is what they actually called pascolo artificiale, which I think is a great term. Despite their apparent lack of interest in diseases, one segment of the Academy's membership was developing such an interest, at least by the early 1760s. And these were physicians. And the most important physician here for us today is a guy named Jacopo Eduardi, who was a member, he was actually the president of the Accademia degli Anistamici in Belluno, and he was a prominent resident in the town. And he begins to write already in the 1750s specifically about the question of animal health. By the early 1760s, he was writing letters and short essays on the need to find a new approach to this epizootic problem. And he compiles all these into a large manuscript that gets published in 1777. And this manuscript's entitled On the Impediments That Are Encountered in the Care of Infirm Animals and the Little Attention Paid to Their Preservation, which is a great title. The treatise represented the culmination of 15 years of thinking on the subject. And Eduardi pointed to the lack of systematic knowledge about animal disease and to the fact that it was useless to debate stocking densities and foddering if you couldn't keep the livestock you already had healthy. Fair enough. He argues that a slavish reliance on traditional practices was holding back the art of animal medicine and that, quote, it was little wonder that livestock are in such terrible health, unquote. And he proceeds to argue the following, and this is a longer quote. In the past, for the care of animals and their diseases, the only people employed were those who did not know how to act, if not behind mere practice. That's the farriers. Whether such practice was heard or seen or merely read, they knew nothing more than the art of healing, and thus their enterprise was unfruitful more than not, and instead of healing the animals, they often accelerated their total loss. Now, this actually is a really interesting passage, and let's take it apart a little bit here. The passage draws our attention to the most common arguments articulated by agrarian writers like Eduardi, and while initially it might appear that he's just blaming the farriers for the crisis, he's actually arguing that farriers and physicians share the blame for the poor condition of livestock. The farriers had, quote, heard or seen, unquote, because Eduardi's still not clued into the fact that the farriers were reading. And the physicians had, quote, merely read, unquote. Neither group, he argued, was incapable of improving animal health because both relied excessively on tradition, and the wrong kind of tradition in particular. Whether these were learned during an apprenticeship in the local forge or by perusing the recipes in some farrier's manual, like Scacco da Tagliacozzo, while observing an outbreak, made no difference to Eduardi. Both approaches, he suggested, would lead to the same pernicious result, which is dead animals. The solution, in his view, was to approach epizootic diseases as both an agrarian problem and a medical one. And in Eduardi's view, this would lead to a new medical science he called zoeatrics, which is another great term. You kind of wish it had won out over veterinary, which in turn would provide a firm natural philosophical foundation for sweeping agrarian reform. And this kind of becomes the terrain on which this is going to be contested. So Eduardi wants zoeatrics, or veterinary medicine, to be a recognized branch of natural philosophy. He wants to take it out of the realm of both the printed manuals and rural practice. Now, Eduardi first uses this term zoeatrics in 1765, but he's not the only person using the term, and he's not the only person interested in this fledgling science. Calls for a new zoeatric medicine from physicians in the Venetian agrarian academies, at least, merged with similar rhetoric emanating from within other institutions of the Venetian Republic. The most enthusiastic proponents of zoeatrics were the members of the Deputati all'Agricoltura, and this is a fairly new 18th century magistracy. And this magistracy's task was to create a complete registry of all cultivated land in Venetian territory. And if you're interested in maps, the Deputati all'Agricoltura have the best maps, because that's what they did. The Agricoltura also decided which projects recommended by these academies deserved state sponsorship. And so by the late 1760s, members of the Agricoltura had taken up the call to action of Eduardi and other academics and had begun pressuring the public health authorities in the Sanità to co-sponsor the establishment of a school, un collegio. The Sanità's initial proposal in 1769 was aimed at establishing a farriery academy where tradesmen could be trained in the latest techniques and therapies, but Eduardi opposed this idea, and he continued to agitate for a different kind of institution, a natural philosophical institution that would train proper medical personnel, not farriers. And Eduardi actually had a very specific model in mind, and it's the veterinary school that the French surgeon Claude Bourgelat had established in Lyon in 1762. And he founds a second one at Alfort near Paris. It would now actually be inside Paris in 1768. Eduardi in particular continually referred to the French model in his writings, but it's clear from the context and terminology that other agrarian writers had Bourgelat's school on their minds as well. Everybody looks to these French schools as the thing to imitate. Under pressure from the academies in the Agricoltura, the Sanità agreed to send 2 students to France to work with Bourgelat. But the 2 magistracies in the academies remained at loggerheads about the ultimate goal of the project. The Sanità imagined that the 2 students would spend 3 years in France, it was a 3-year course, and then return and open the farriery school. It's also clear from their letters to the Senate that the public health authorities never imagined that the 2 students would be asked to replace the magistracy's physicians at the site of outbreak. So the Sanità is very concerned about its institutional authority, and what they don't want is they don't want veterinarians to take the place of the protomedici as the people assigned to manage the outbreaks, because this would undermine their authority. And it's worth keeping in mind that this is exactly the moment when plague ends. Plague is over. And so you have this institution with not a whole lot to do, and here's something for them to do, and the Agricoltura is trying to take it away from them. So this is really an institutional turf battle more than anything else. But then it comes to play out with these very high-minded arguments about what the real solution to this problem is. And the Sanità's notion that these students would mostly interact with farriers was actually consistent, not just with practices in Venice, but everywhere in Europe. And it also corresponded to what most of the graduates of Bourgelat's school seem to have done in the first couple of decades of its existence. The first several cohorts of students who studied with Bourgelat were almost exclusively sponsored either by aristocratic patrons or military authorities. And in both cases, the idea was they would come home and they would run the stable. Whether it was the cavalry stable or the duke's stable, didn't matter. They were not, nobody imagined, and not even Bourgelat himself, that they would be understood as physicians. They wouldn't be doctors. Indeed, the Alfort school in particular was housed in the same chateau as the Army School for Cavalry Officers, which tells you what it's there for. The point was that the French founders of zoeatric medicine envisioned the new science as taking place in a very limited specific context, not as a generalized practice. And indeed, Giuseppe Orus, and now back to him, he had studied at Alfort, and he fits the profile perfectly. He was from Parma. He had been sent by the Duke of Parma to study under Bourgelat because the Duke was embarrassed by the quality of his mounts. And he wanted Orus to come back and breed better horses for him. That was the whole point. Here, the peculiarities of the Venetian context helped us to understand why this changes in Venice and nowhere else, at least at first. Venice had no ducal stable. The Doge didn't need to ride. There was a cavalry school at Verona, but it was pretty small and it was very poorly funded, and nobody wanted to be associated with it particularly. And while some mainland elites were certainly interested in horse breeding, the people calling for the establishment of zoeatric medicine were bourgeois academics. They weren't aristocratic horse riders. Eduardi never once mentions horses in any of his writings, not once. I mean, it's kind of remarkable given that all of the printed literature is about horses. All of the debate is about horses. Eduardi couldn't care less about horses. In this sense, whatever he and other Venetian subjects saw when they looked to France and the French model, it was not an obvious fit for anything that was happening in the Republic. So they accept nominations from the mainland agrarian academies. They picked 2 youths to go to Paris, and it was hard to find 2 youths because they needed to find 2 youths who spoke French, and you couldn't find people who, A, knew how to speak French, and were willing to go study zoeatrics, and the people willing to go study zoeatrics didn't speak French. Orus is a weird case. His father was French. He was one of the court physicians in Parma, but he himself was French, so Orus grew up speaking French in the home. He was an oriundo, as we would say. Still, by August 1772, when they're almost ready to send they finally find 2 youths, they're going to send them to France. Eduardi writes to the Deputati all'Agricoltura, he says, stop everything. Giuseppe Orus, with whom he had been in correspondence for at least a year, had returned to Parma to find the Duke was dead. And the new Duke was eager to trim expenses at court, and the easiest expenses to trim were the new ones, and Orus was a new expense. So he was out of a job. And so Eduardi says, we may be able to open a school immediately instead of waiting 3 years for the chosen youths to return. And in fact, to say that Orus was Eduardi's ideal candidate may be to understate the case. Eduardi had first written to Orus to sound him out on his experiences under Bourgeois' tutelage 2 years earlier. What sort of youths, Eduardi inquired, would in your opinion be best suited to the discipline of the art? The possibility for Orus of an alternate patron was not lost. When he first returned to Parma, he wrote letters to a school friend at Alfort describing in detail the great praise I've received from the Agrarian academies of Italy, by which he seems to have meant the letters he got from Eduardi, because there's nothing else. But anyway, the agreement that the Venetians forged with Orus represented a real novelty for this new science. The Venetian Senate, over the objections of the Sanità, who again are interested in protecting their turf, made Orus' school a part of the medical faculty of the University of Padua, and it's the first one. There's no other school or college of zoeatrics or veterinary medicine that's housed in a medical school, much less a medical school with Padua's prestige. It's waning prestige in the 18th century, but it's still prestige. And thus, Orus found himself at the quite young age of 21, ascending from being a graduate of what was essentially a glorified trade school to holding a chair in what was still one of the most important medical faculties in Europe. But this new college or institute was peculiar, and to begin with, it occupied an unusual place within the structure of the university. The Senate had given the college an independent endowment taken from the coffers of the Agricoltura and the Sanità. Orus was not beholden to the university's administration, and in exchange for agreeing to this plan, the Sanità demanded and received final say over the curriculum and the selection of the students. So here you again can see the bureaucratic turf wars at work. And those of us who are familiar with the operations of the modern university, this question of who controls the endowment and controls everything else is key here. So Eduardi and his fellow agrarian reformers got the school they wanted, but it was a school devoted to training professionals who would be bound to the state and specifically to the Sanità. So what the Sanità gets out of this is they're saying, fine, you can make them doctors, but they're our doctors. They're not yours. Where Eduardi and the agrarian reformers agreed with public health authorities was on who should study there. And clearly under the most optimistic conditions, a zoeatric doctor would not occupy the same social and scientific status as a regular physician, and the solution was to recruit students from families of members of lower status medical professions, so that the agrarian academies had to nominate and financially support plausible students for inclusion in Orus's first class. And the public health authorities also looked, I shouldn't tell this part at La Pietra, but why not? They looked outside the boundaries of the state for what we might term full tuition paying students. So 6 members of the initial class of 21 were from other Italian states, and they paid. 2 were from Modena, 1 from Ferrara, and 2 were from Naples, although one of the students from Modena was almost immediately expelled and he was replaced with a student from Udine, a guy by the name of Piero Medici, which is a great name for this for lots of reasons. The student from Modena got expelled. He was an aristocrat, and Orus was really heavily into discipline, and there was a curfew, and they had to be twice daily communicants and all these kinds of things. And this young aristocrat didn't take well to that, and he took out his frustrations on the staff. He was beating the cooks, and so Orus had him thrown away. Some were orphans, sponsored by elite members of the Agrarian academies, although two were, quote unquote, I would say, orphans sponsored by local clergy. You can imagine where they came from. Others, like the young Piero Medici, were the children of members of minor medical professions. His father was an apothecary. And then some others were sons of barber surgeons. And these families thought this would be a step up for the family. From our perspective, we might say that the way in which Orus and his collaborators chose to define the expertise of this new class of veterinarians solved many of the epistemological and practical problems that these epizootic diseases presented. The zoeatric physician would combine the agrarian knowledge of the farrier with the medical knowledge of the physician. He would know the lifeways of large domesticates as well as the subtleties of Galenic etiology, and at least in theory, a properly trained zoeatric physician would not simply replicate the practices of human medicine, nor would he imitate the pharmaceutical recipes contained in those farrier texts. Orus himself was clearly thinking in these terms from the moment he arrived. He quickly appropriated the rhetoric of Eduardi and other agrarian reformers from his very first interactions with Venetian authorities. So you can say that Orus he's young, but he's not stupid. On the eve of his return to Padua, he'd written a long letter to the dying Duke about the virtues of selective breeding of horses and his plan to provide him with the most noble mounts that will be the envy of Italian rulers. He arrives in Padua about 2 months later, and he tells his Venetian patrons that veterinary medicine was important because, quote, agriculture is the foundation of every state, and the proper care and regulation of livestock is the lifeblood of agriculture, unquote. So he knows to whom he's speaking. Moreover, in keeping with his sudden change in status from stable master to professor, he repeatedly emphasized that zoeatric medicine required both traditional and medical learning and a profound theoretical understanding of both medical practice and of farriery. Now, it would be easy to dismiss this enthusiasm for agrarian reform as self-interested, and it certainly was. However, other evidence reveals that he fully embraced this newly expansive view of animal health and of its social importance. Since both Orus's notes from Alfort, notes he took as a student, and his own lectures at Padua, I have them both, we can actually compare his curriculum to Bourgelat's. Bourgelat devoted nearly all of his 3-year curriculum to horses. That's it. It's a horse health course. Students did not begin to work on bovine physiology until halfway through the 3rd and final year. Orus, by contrast, spent the first year of his 4-year curriculum entirely on cows, and in the 2nd year, sheep. He doesn't get to horses until the 3rd year. He also opened a clinic at the school to give his students practice, diagnosing and treating ailments. And again, the records of the clinic survive intact. So the variety of animals that were brought in for treatment is kind of fun. So I'll just tell you it includes dogs, cats, birds, a mouse, and my favorite, a camel with a hurt paw, in addition to cows and sheep, which is what Orus had hoped for. At the conclusion of each academic year, he awarded a medal for practice and a medal for theory. It was in his contract. He would get these gold medals to give to the students, and these went to the students who performed best in the clinic with its menagerie of domesticated animals. Now, there's something admirable about the curriculum with its emphasis on practical skills, especially in contrast with the hands-off nature of traditional medical training, with the students seated in an anatomy theater while the professor directs the surgeon's actions and points out the salient structures. Orus did his own dissecting. And he had the students come and cut as well, which explains why his anatomy lectures were the most popular. So all the medical students came to watch him cut open animals, and the demonstrations were so popular that he actually had to ask the school to build a barrier around the dissection table so that he wouldn't be crushed by the students climbing over him to get a look. However, and here by way of conclusion, where we really see the depth of Orus's embrace of the veterinarian as physician and agrarian reformer is in the way that he and his students behaved whenever they traveled to the site of an outbreak. To see his method at work, let's join him on one such excursion in December 1779. And it's a major outbreak of cattle plague in Istria. And at first, Orus just exchanges letters with local authorities, but in early February, with the outbreak showing no signs of abating, he decides to evaluate the situation in person. And he was a really tediously copious note keeper, which is great for me, but he must have not been a very interesting guy. In his reports, Orus deployed the full range of his expertise. He diagnoses the disease as a respiratory disease, which he identified as pleuropneumonia, which is actually a term we still use, although it's probably not the same disease, instead of the more vulgar farrier's term of pulmonare, or just of the lung. The diagnosis was based both on an observation of the symptoms, coughing, foaming at the nostrils, excess of phlegm, and several post-mortem dissections he performed on site, in which the congestion of the lungs and heart he found was described in great detail. He then points to his common set of interrelated causes for the disease: filthy stalls, infected pastures, places, sharing troughs with sick animals, water, and moving too quickly from the cold to the heat and back again, airs. These are the three fundamental diagnostic techniques of Galenic medicine. All of this causes a noxious fluctuation of the humors, and he recommends a combination of dietary changes, again, a Galenic staple, and environmental controls. The recommendations came in the form of condemnations of local practice. So he noted, quote, the common practice of farriers and blacksmiths who are accustomed to bleeding the beasts, which only serves to exacerbate the humoral imbalance and makes the disease worse. On the environmental side, he also found much to criticize in the way they managed their pastures. He wanted faster rotations, prohibition on using wet grass, and several pages he devotes to the most important environment of all, the barn. He critiqued local traditions of barn constructions. He says they need to be reoriented, and so on and so forth. Now, the reports touch on a remarkable range of issues. He identifies disease using a medical term that was not part of that printed tradition of farriers' texts, nor is it found in any of the printed manuals. He also took his readers through the postmortems in all their gory detail. He offered up Galenic prescriptions that took into account what cattle normally ate, where they normally went, how they normally behaved, and finally he went into considerable detail on the most modern ideas about barn construction. On the practical issues as well as the epistemological issues, Orus and his students appeared to be offering far more complete answers than any of their predecessors, including the public health authorities. Obviously, his authority had limits. He could pronounce on bad habits of barn building, but I doubt any barns were rebuilt. His authority was also undermined in some sense by the torturous conditions of the school's founding, because the Sanità only supported the college once it had been forced upon them, and had ultimately decided to deal with the imposition of the school by co-opting its graduates into their institutions. Orus's voice was ironically far stronger on issues of public health than it was on issues of agrarian reform. So the Sanità got the curricular control of an institution it had not wanted in the first place, while the Agricoltura and the academies got an institution they'd wanted, but which ultimately failed to address the problems they'd been interested in. More importantly, when Orus collapsed and died suddenly at the site of a 1792 outbreak, his college collapsed and died with him. Within 2 days of the news of his death reaching Venice, the Riformatori allo Studio di Padua, who were like essentially the board of trustees for the University of Padua, petitioned the Senate for permission to take control of the college. This will surprise nobody, of the college and especially of the endowment, away from the Sanità and the Agricoltura. The Sanità declared that while we are quite satisfied with the work of the late professor, we believe that he has already provided our physicians with the necessary knowledge. We don't need it anymore. In other words, the Sanità was satisfied that physicians could return to merely reading about animal diseases. When the Senate complied, the Riformatori then changed the curriculum to a 2-year program, quote, more suited to a manual art, unquote, and so the Agricoltura ends up getting the institution they didn't want. The chair itself was correspondingly downgraded, and the college's students were no longer allowed to attend classes offered by other members of the medical faculty, and Orus would actually make his students go to chemistry lectures and so on and so forth. And it would be another 40 years before another veterinarian would hold a university chair in medicine. An institution founded in a period of enthusiasm for agrarian reform withered because it had not fully convinced public health authorities that agrarian reform and disease were actually related problems. And I think I went a little bit long, but thanks.
your work is primarily about Venice, but I was wondering whether in any of the states that had similarly important medical faculties, whether there were any analogous attempts to establish anything even remotely like what they did in Padua.
Yeah, so good question. It's so there is a veterinary school that's established in Bologna, but it's for training farriers, essentially. It's for training stable masters. And the other one that predates Padua in Italy is, by 2 years, is one that is started in Turin. But again, that's, they want a royal stable master, and so that's why it's a cavalry school. So those are the other two main schools that predate the one in Padua, and then the one that comes after is in Milan, and again, that's for the Duke's horses. And then what happens is Orus dies in 1792, but then it actually all ends when Napoleon comes. And what Napoleon does is he shuts down all of the veterinary colleges in Italy except the one in Milan. And so one of the reasons, there's a weird story about Orus's papers, and I think they survive in some sense only because of this. So what happens is Napoleon shuts everything down. The only school left is the one in Milan. It has a French director, and it becomes fully Francofied. In the 1820s and 30s, some Italian cities decide that they want to reopen veterinary schools, and one of the first ones is Parma. And they put this local aristocrat in charge of it, and he goes around, he's rich, and he goes to all of the shuttered schools, the one in Bologna, the one in Padua, the one in Turin, and he just buys all the paper. And then, weirdly enough, the Biblioteca dell'Archiginnasio, this guy donates his whole library to the Biblioteca dell'Archiginnasio in Bologna, and so all of the veterinary papers from all of the veterinary schools from before Napoleon are all in the Biblioteca dell'Archiginnasio instead of. So I looked for years in Padua, and I couldn't find. I was like, God, because I could see I got half of his correspondence with Venetian authorities in Venice because there were copies of these letters in the various archives, and I thought it has to be somewhere. And I went to everything in Padua, and I couldn't find it, and then eventually I saw a footnote somewhere quoting some letter that he'd written to someone else from the Biblioteca Archiginnasio. I said, well, let's go see, and then boom, it was all there. So so the answer then is still Padua remains the only one founded under those auspices, and that's true well into the 19th century, especially in other European states. So I don't know, the Spanish veterinarians don't get to be part of the university until the 1890s. And that involves a very similar process of rebranding, because they were known as pecorados, and then they rebrand themselves as livestock engineers, and then that allows them to become university faculty. So.
I understand this was part of Finicide, but you said something about physicians being concerned with border matters. Could you speak a little about that?
Sure. So these, especially the bovine disease outbreaks, are an international problem in the 18th century, because that Hungarian trade it's not just going to Venice, it's going everywhere. And so Hungarian cattle, beef cattle, are going to France, they're going to the Low Countries, they're going to all of German-speaking Europe, and they're also coming to Italy. So the diseases, these outbreaks are happening everywhere. And so it becomes a problem, because if you are, say, just to use the Venetian example, but it's not the only one. So you impose a quarantine. You say there's an outbreak in this border town in Istria, because the border with the Habsburgs runs straight down the peninsula. You, as the public health authority in Venice, you can inspect anybody's barn, anybody's house, anybody's pasture you want on your side of the border, and you can declare the epizootic finished, end it on your side, and they have the same kinds of rules. You have to have a double quarantine, you have to have 80 days without any new cases before they'll declare an area disease-free. But you can't go into a barn on the other side of the border. And so actually what happens, and you can see it in the records of the Sanità, is that these protomedici become involved in very elaborate negotiations with their counterparts on the other side. And so you'll see them writing letters back to Venice saying, well, you know, there aren't any more sick cows in Raspo, but on the other side of the river, in, you know, Clapuch or whatever, they say there aren't any sick animals, but I'm pretty sure there are. And so don't lift the quarantine on the border, just lift the quarantine here. And then the Senate has to write to the Habsburg court in Vienna to say, our public health authorities tell us that your public health authorities are telling you a lie. Would you please send somebody down to tell them to stop lying? And so it becomes this extremely elaborate set of negotiations that accompany every single one of these outbreaks. Then if you add in, like I was saying at the beginning, that say, you know, the Podestà in Brescia is sending soldiers out to shoot at Milanese peasants, that also becomes a diplomatic issue in and of itself. And so there's this way in which it's very, very different from just locking people up inside a city until the outbreak has burned itself out. And so it's true that quarantining, say, foreign merchants' goods and things like that could lead to an exchange of diplomatic letters, but it's an order of magnitude different for the Senate to be writing to the ducal chancery in Vienna saying your local health inspector is lying to us. That is some other kind of level of diplomatic involvement.
So in southern Italy, I guess, since there were few or no cows, I mean, or like, you know, maybe there's less of a trade. I mean, how long did it take for veterinary medicine to develop, you know, south of Rome? Or
well, there are two Neapolitan students in that first class at Padua, so
they went back.
The King of Naples wanted people trained in it, and Venice is just the first stop on this trading route. So the cattle that are coming from Hungary, which that's the biggest supply, they come over, they come down, they end up in what's today Marghera, which is the big kind of refinery area that you pass on the train on your way into Venice. And they have a pen there. And then buyers come from all over Italy to buy the animals. And so they buy them and then they drive them all the way down to Sicily. How many of them, it's hard to say. I can tell you because the Venetians, again, were very precise kind of record keepers, I can tell you with immense precision how many were slaughtered in Venice, say. But how many of them actually end up down in Naples, I don't know. And then the other thing is that the Neapolitans had their own set of long-standing experiences with animals and animal disease, because there's the Dogana di Foggia, which is the center of wool production. They brought huge herds. There was this transhuman economy in Naples. They brought, you know, tens of thousands of head of sheep down from the Abruzzi to shear every winter, and in Foggia, and then that wool would get exported all over the place to Spain. And there were actually a lot of outbreaks of ovine diseases that occurred, and there were similar problems. I mean, the other way in which in a way answers both your questions is that these routes, both the transhuman ones for the Dogana di Foggia and these beef cattle routes, they have to be really carefully controlled, because, you know, cattle do an immense amount of damage, and so you can only bring a certain number at a time. They have to stop at certain designated places. They can only cross the border at certain kinds of designated places, because local property owners don't want, like, you know, 2,000 head of cattle suddenly appearing and saying, we need a place to stay for the night. So, but does that result in a veterinary college in Naples? Not until much later. But the idea was they have a kind of royal stable and a farrier school, farriery school.
Was there any kind of like national coordination when did that develop, like, within the after
Well,
unification?
it's still developing, right? Well, I mean, I think there's a certain amount of coordination that emerges from this, and I guess I could probably dig them up, but by the 1730s, let's say if the Venetians identify an outbreak, they have treaty obligations to tell the Milanese, to tell the Ferraresi, the Modenesi, and so on. And so what you'll see is that, Venice will print a quarantine edict someplace in Venetian territory in August, and then in September there'll be one in Modena and one in Ferrara, and by September there's one in Rome, and they're saying don't buy or consume beef that comes from these Venetian sources. So, and there's one sort of semi-famous case where the Pope in 1704 or 5 writes to Venice to complain because Venice has kept the quarantine on longer and the Pope's got no more steak. And so he has the nuncio in Venice go complain to the Senate. He wants beef, and anyway. Thank you.